Okay. How's everybody doing this morning? You guys all okay? Nice. Lovely to start another week. And for us, it also means starting our second formal language. So the aim for today is to go through as much of the material that I've got here as we can. I want to start by spelling out the building blocks, the fundamental building blocks for FOL. And here what we're really going to do is talk about the nature of the language, right? The constituent parts of the language and how they fit together. So really just kind of talking initially about some grammar stuff to make sure that we're all on the same page. After that, I want to go through a couple practice FOL symbolizations. So in particular, I want to think about sentences with one quantifier, because that's going to be the big trick with this language, is learning how to use the quantifiers and to think about some basic structures that are going to come up again and again and again and again to make sure that we know how to do those four basic structures. This isn't going to capture every single symbolization, but it's going to do a lot of work for us. And then if we have time, we'll wrap up by talking about cases where we have multiple quantifiers and relational predicates. So more on exactly what that is in just a few minutes. But let's get started by talking about the building blocks of FOL. So as a kind of warm-up as to why we'd be interested in FOL, here's a really simple argument. So it looks a lot like the first one we did in the first homework assignment. So question, valid, invalid. Valid, invalid. It's valid, right? It should be valid. Here's the trick. Do the premises tautologically entail the conclusion? So if we symbolize this into TFL, right, would it tell us that the argument's valid? Unfortunately, no. Because when we symbolize this into TFL, we get something like this. And no matter how hard you try, there's no way that two atoms are going to tautologically entail a third atom, because the switches are just set up so where we can switch them on and off however we like. There's guaranteed to be a valuation where the premises are true and the conclusion's false. So what's the problem? The problem is the reason why the argument is valid, to go back a slide, is about the relationship between the various predicates that we're ascribing and the individuals we're picking out. If you remember when we talked about the one that was like this in the first tutorial, we did it with Venn diagrams. We had to be able to pick out particular individuals. We had to have Socrates, and we had to be able to draw the circles for, in this case, it would be humans and things that are mortal. But we can't do that in TFL. And we can't do that in TFL because the basic unit is a sentence. It doesn't have things like names to pick out individuals or predicates to ascribe things like the circles, right? The properties that we're ascribing. So we need to make a really bad joke that I'll repeat a bunch in the next few weeks, split the atom. We have to go into the atomic sentences and think about subsentential parts. So that's the big advantage of FOL. It's going to give us subsentential parts. The elements in our language are going to include things like names and predicates, and will build atomic sentences. So the language is going to look a bit like this. We're going to have as our very base unit something that looks akin to this. It's going to have a subject and a predicate, just like base units of most natural languages, right? A subject and a verb, the verb being the thing being done, right? So our new base unit isn't just a capital letter, it's always going to be a capital and a lowercase letter, always. You will not have an FOL sentence that doesn't have at least one capital letter and at least one lowercase letter. Now we're also going to have different ways to talk about objects. We'll be able to pick out individuals, or we'll be able to have functions that let us potentially pick out multiple individuals. But more on that in just a second. Again, the core here, though, is that our new base unit, the fundamental sentence, isn't just an atom, but it has parts. It's not indivisible. It will have bits that make it up. And because we have those bits, we can do more. We'll have greater expressive power. So how does it do that? FOL is going to have 6 kinds of symbols as its constitutive elements. First, we're going to have what we'll call terms, and terms come in 2 types. We'll have names, which are lowercase letters, A through R, and we'll have variables, which are lowercase letters, S through Z, or Z, if you're North American. Then we'll also have capital letters, which will be our predicates. Again, the base unit is always going to be predicate and term. Then we're going to have our connectives. The connectives work just like they did in TFL. And we're going to have brackets. The brackets basically work just like they did in TFL. They're going to indicate scope. And finally, we're going to have these 2 beauties, the quantifiers. And these are functions that allow us to pick out individuals or, again, potentially multiple individuals. So let's go through these one at a time to make sure that we understand how the grammar here works. So terms. To get a run-up on how terms in FOL work, we can think about how terms work in English. In English, there's actually quite a few different kinds of terms, but there's really 2 broad kinds. They're what we might think of as singular terms, which purport to refer to specific entities. And there's general terms, which pick out kinds or types. So the way to get a grip on this is just a contrast between something like Socrates and human. Right? Socrates is a singular term because it purports to pick out the dude. Human is a general term because it picks out something like the kind that he is an instance of. Again, you can kind of see how this goes, right? City, Tilburg. Country, Netherlands. Again, keep going with this, right? Now, when we think about singular terms, right, that purport to pick out specific entities, there's a lot of different kinds that we have in English. But 2 that are really interesting, we have proper names, like Socrates, and definite descriptions, which are, as the name suggests, descriptions that pick out or are satisfied by one and only one object. So the idea here is, right, you can contrast Socrates, the name Socrates, versus the teacher of Plato. The definite description picks out or denotes the same object as the proper name, but it might do it in a different way. The name kind of just tags the guy. The description is whoever satisfies those properties. So in FOL, our terms are all singular terms. And you remember, there's 2 kinds. There's names and there's variables. So names we express with lowercase letters between A and R. We can use subscripts if we really want to go nuts, right? And they function very similar to English proper names with a few exceptions. First, there's no ambiguity. Each name picks out exactly one thing. So that means we're not going to have some kind of name like John that could potentially denote a bunch of different people. There's always going to be, if you have a name, it's guaranteed to pick out one thing. Similarly, if you have a name, it's guaranteed to pick out a thing. That is, we will have no empty names in first order logic. So empty names are names that, right, try to pick out an object, but the thing just ain't there. Again, I hate to crush hopes and dreams, but Santa Claus is a good one, right? Santa Claus is an empty name because, sad but true, he just ain't there for us, right? He never showed up at my house anyway. So, again, FOL names, they pick out particular objects, just like in English, but two important things: no ambiguity and no empty names. And an FOL symbolization key is going to map names to things that we're considering picking out, right? So you'll just have something like this, right? Lowercase a for Socrates, lowercase m for Mira, lowercase n for Nathan. Yeah.
Just to make sure, it says in the book that two different names may take out the same thing. Or do we do that, like actually for Cliff, like while we're translating these to FL, is that ever useful?
It will be. But importantly, to get there, we're going to need something we'll talk about next week. So we'll come back around to this case. So what's important is that every name picks out exactly one thing. So each name is guaranteed to pick out an object, and there's no ambiguity about that. There might be multiple names for the same object. You just can't have a name that doesn't pick out anything at all, that fails to refer. Yes, there will be cases where we'll want to be able to talk about the same thing with two different names. We'll come to that, though. Okay. So that's names. The other kind of term that we have are variables. Variables will probably be kind of familiar to some of you if you've done, well, basically any math past algebra. Right? Variables we express in FOL with a lowercase s through z. Again, you can use subscripts if you like. Note that what variables do for us is effectively give us ways to tag gaps. And gaps that can be filled in with names or with objects. So you can get a grip on it by kind of looking at it this way, right? Take this sentence, he loves her, but she doesn't love him. Right? Clearly easy to understand. And it's easy to understand that the he and the him are supposed to be picking out the same person. But note, these are pronouns. They're not names. So there's a sense in which the he and the him aren't really naming an individual. Instead, they're kind of spaces where we could replace the name or replace the pronoun with the name of the relevant individual. Right? Finn loves Princess Bubblegum, but Bubblegum doesn't love Finn, for an example. Right? So what do? Well, in FOL, instead of using anything like pronouns or color coding them, we fill the gaps with the variables. They tell us that, hey, right, whatever you plug in for the X in this spot, you also need to fill in the X in this spot. And the same thing with the Y here, right? The Y is doing the same, but for her. And all this is telling us is that whatever you fill in for the blue gap or the X gap, the same damn thing better appear in the other one too. And the one that you fill in for the Y or the red, right, could be the same object, could be a different object as the one that you did for the X, but it needs to be the same object in both occurrences of Y. So again, the basic idea here is that these variables aren't anything like names. They're, if you just like, labels for gaps, labels for spaces that we can fill in with names. So what this means is that when we're writing up an FOL symbolization key, there's absolutely no way to tell us what variables stand for, because they don't stand for nothing. They're just ways for us to label gaps. The other fundamental element here, right, because again, remember, we have terms and we have predicates. Those are going to be our two elements of the fundamental sentence of FOL. Predicates are parts of language that ascribe properties. They often consist of a copula, so something like an is or an are, right, and a general term. So you get is human, is mortal, is a carrot. predicates link up with singular terms to form basic sentences. Is a man, Socrates, pen, pineapple, apple pen, and you get Socrates is human. In FOL symbolization keys, we'll express them as capital letters. We can use the subscript, and it will tell us what's the English predicate that they're expressing. So capital H here is expressing the is human, T expresses woke up at 3:30, and T1 is a terminator, just as an example. Make sense? So good so far? Okay, going slow because it's important we get this basic stuff right. So we can begin to get a grip on building FOL sentences by looking at how predicates and terms go together. The hint is in the way that we write these down, right? What we're going to be able to do is fill in names to these gaps in the predicates. But we're not going to write them like in English. Instead, we write them with the predicate, the capital letter in the front, and then either the name or the variable that we're going to slot in just after. So HA in this case gives us a way to say Socrates is human. HX is a way to say X is human. Note here, again, to stress, X is not a name, it is a variable. And I can say TM for Mira woke up at 3:30, or TM and TN for Mira and I both woke up at 3:30. Again, we can embed these things into our connectives. They're going to behave just like they did with TFL, but instead of having just the atomic sentences as our base unit, it's always predicate and term. Cool? Feel like we get the basics so far? All right, let's have a go. So, same symbolization key, right? We've got it up over here with some names and some predicates. Let's rock through these really quickly, make sure we're all on board, right? So how would we do with this key? Mira woke up at 3:30. TM, right? TN. Cool. And Socrates is a terminator? Yes, T1A, right? T subscript 1A. Nathan and Socrates are human. So what we've got to be careful here, there's a temptation to write it as H-A-N or H-N-A, but that doesn't say that, right? If we look, H only has one gap. So we need to write H-N for Nathan is human, conjunction H-A for Socrates is human. If we write multiple terms after the predicate, that's going to mean something very different in this language. We're going to get to it at the very end of today's lecture. If you want to say multiple things satisfy the predicate, you've got to use conjunction and multiple sentences. And finally, right, if Nathan woke up at if Mira woke up at 3:30, then Nathan woke up at 3:30. Again, you can see what's the main operator of this sentence going to be? It's a conditional, right? And then our antecedent is going to be Mira woke up at 3:30, so TM, and our consequence going to be TN. Bingo, bango. Note, just like before, we can put the brackets on the outside. You can leave them off. The same conventions hold as before. Okay, if we can do this, we've got the fundamentals. The fun stuff is going to be once we start introducing variables. Because when we have a variable, again, it's a label for a gap. So we need to know how we can fill in the gaps. And this is where quantifiers are going to come in. But before we talk about the quantifiers, right, we get it when we're just playing with names. Questions on this bit so far? Feeling okay? All right, so let's talk about quantifiers. We've got two quantifiers. We've got our upside down A and our backwards E. These are going to be intimately bound up with variables. Remember, as I said, variables are ways for us to tag gaps. Quantifiers are the functions that tell us how we're supposed to fill in these gaps. Who can replace the variables? What this means is that quantifiers, whenever we write them, will always be attached to a variable, and variables will always be associated with a relevant quantifier. Because the variables are labeling the gaps, the quantifier is telling us how to fill them in. You can think about the quantifiers as something like the arms in crane games. You guys all know what the crane games, right? Where you move it around and you try and grab a stuffy and then it never fucking works. So the quantifiers here function kind of like those grabber arms, but they do two different things. So the first one, our upside down A, the universal quantifier. It is a way for us to say for all or every. So it says for all x if we attach it to x, for all y if we attach it to y. The function of the universal is that it will be true, it will output true, if and only if everything can be filled in for the relevant variable. So that is, it is like the grabber arm that just can grab any damn thing from inside the crane, and whatever it grabs is guaranteed to satisfy the associated sentence. You can replace the associated variable with any damn thing you like. That sentence should turn out to be true. Says the universal. So what this really means is that the universal is similar to a massive conjunction. So if you have for all x, hx, that means A is an H, and B is an H, and C is an H, and D is an H, and so on for every damn thing. Because again, what's the universal function say? You can replace the associated variable with everything. So that upside down A, or universal, is for all, for every. Our second quantifier, the existential, is for some, or perhaps even better, for at least one. So how does it work? Well, it tells us that, hey, you can reach down into the crane and there's guaranteed to be at least one thing in there that you could grab, pull out, and will satisfy the associated sentence. It might be a bunch. It might be all of them. It might be just one. But the existential says, for at least something, blah, blah, blah. So in this sense, an existential is a bit like a giant disjunction. If we take existential x, hx, that really means, hey, either A is an H, or B is an H, or C is an H, or so on and so on and so on. Again, inclusive or, so it could be all of them, or it might just be one. The thing to emphasize with the quantifiers is, in both cases, they'll always be attached to a variable, and that variable is the gaps that we're filling in. The quantifier tells us how it is you're supposed to fill those gaps in. Universal says, pick anybody you like, it should still work out. The existential says, hey, there's at least one person you can pick who's going to do the job for you. Okay. Yes?
If you were to say existential X, that would not entail the thing that's underneath.
That's bad. We'll come to that in just a second. Okay, so a couple shots just to make sure we're good with this. Again, getting the very, very basics. Same symbolization key we had. How would we do everyone's human? If we were going to do everyone's human, how would we do that? Yeah, for all x, hx. Now, some people probably just realize that's the reason why the textbook has the name that it does. How about someone is human? It's our existential, right? It's our existential. Existential x, hx. Note, we could also use y or z or any other damn variable you like, as long as you've got the same one attached to the existential as the gap in the predicate. Okay. How about there's a human and Mira woke up at 3:30?
Existential X, HX, conjunction, and HN.
Not hn, but yeah. It's okay. Yeah, we got it. We got it. Right? Now, this also tells us something interesting about the grammar, and we'll get to it in just a second as well. But one thing to note, when we introduce quantifiers, if it's just going to be attached directly to a sentence, just to a predicate and a term, you don't need to add brackets. But if it's going to be attached to a more complex sentence, you'll need brackets because it will tell us the scope of the quantifier. Again, I'll repeat that in just a moment, but I want to go ahead and say it. So our last one, if Socrates is a terminator, then everyone is. So our antecedent, right? Socrates is a terminator, we did that before. And then we know how to say everyone's a terminator. Bingo, bango. Cool so far? Again, getting this basic idea? Nice. So this is how the language is going to go, right? It's going to use these elements in various combinations. And honestly, with this, we will have an amazing amount of expressive power. We will be able to capture damn near everything that we can in English with an extremely clear, precise, unambiguous language. But here's a fun one. If we say, if someone's a terminator, then everyone is. So first question, how many quantifiers are we going to need for this sentence? 2, right? 2. We're going to need 1 for the antecedent, 1 to say someone, and we're going to need 1 to say everyone. And they're going to be different quantifiers, right? The someone is the existential, the everyone is the universal. So we could do it something like this. Now I want to note, in this case, note the scopes of the relevant quantifiers. The scope of the existential is just that antecedent. The scope of the universal is just that consequent. Right? They are detached from each other. They don't overlap. And that's really important. Because remember what the variables are, and remember what the quantifiers are. Variables are ways to label gaps. Quantifiers are functions to tell us how we're supposed to fill in the gaps. So a giant no-no here is having a clash of variables. A clash of variables is where we have the same variable, literally the same little lowercase letter, attached to multiple quantifiers at the same time within the same scope. Like this one. So what's the problem with this? Well, think about this sentence. Oh, well, let's take this one. Let's take that x right there. Which function is that x attached to? There's a sense in which it feels like it should be attached to the existential. Right? But note that it's also within the scope of that universal. So that means that we should be able to apply both functions at the same time to it. But the two functions do two very different things. So we have an ambiguity in the language, and we don't like ambiguities. So we can never have what we'll call clashes of variables. Variables can only serve one master at a time. They can only be attached to one function at a time. So we can never do this kind of thing. Never have two quantifiers that scope over each other, both attached to the same variable, because then we don't know how to fill in the associated gap. Instead, use a different variable. Make it clear. Who's doing what to who, which gap is associated with which function. Again, in this case, we've made it very clear that the universal is only attached to gaps labeled with y. The existential is the one attached to the ones labeled with x. Okay. Again, just kind of getting really clear on the basics here, because if we don't understand this fundamental aspects of the grammar, all the rest ain't gonna work. Okay. The last little thing to talk about the language is talking about a very favorite subject of mine, beer, right? Over the weekend, watching football with my buddy Alfred, and right as we're going through the football game, Alfred asked me to go get us a beer from the fridge, and I opened the fridge, and genuine tragedy, all the beer is gone, right? But of course, when I say all the beer is gone, I don't mean that there's no beer anywhere. I just mean that there's no beer in the fridge. If there was no beer anywhere, then I think probably life wouldn't be worth living. But that's a different point. So there's a kind of, when I say all the beer is gone, there's a contextual restriction implicit in my statement. I'm saying there's no beer in the fridge. So in English, we typically restrict what we're talking about implicitly. Context does the job. Everyone's here. What do I mean by everyone's here? Well, I don't mean literally everyone in the world. I mean everyone in the class. But of course, in first order logic, we don't have things like context or implicature or pragmatics. We have to make this explicit. And we make it explicit by adding one more element to our symbolization keys. We add domains. Domains are collections of things that we're going to talk about. Right? And every FOL symbolization key will specify domains. They could do this very generally. So they will say, hey, it's all of the things that are located in space and time. Or it's all the things that are on the fridge, or all the things that are on the desk here. Or it might be a list. The domain is Nathan, Mira, and Amanda. Again, all that matters is the domain specifies the collection of objects we're interested in. To put it metaphorically, the domain is the stuff that's inside the crane for the quantifiers to go in and grab. So quantifiers range over this domain. That's the kind of stuff that it can function on, that it can fill the various associated gaps with. So this means that whenever you have any of these sentences, you'll always have a domain. Because the domain is telling you these are the objects that we're talking about. Importantly, we have some restrictions on the nature of domains in our language. First, the domain always has to include at least one thing. In our language, in this version of FOL, we cannot have an empty domain. And the kind of motivation for this goes along with the idea that we cannot have empty names. Together, these ensure that whenever we have a sentence featuring a name, we can make a jump to an existential. So again, a thing to stress, a domain must have at least one member, and a name must pick out exactly one member of the domain. But a member of the domain could be picked out by one, many, or even no names. Because the fact that something's in the domain doesn't necessarily mean we have a name for it. Okay. Cool. So we're at 21. I want to go through a couple early moves, early points about FOL symbolization, and then we'll get to our break. So 10 more minutes, maybe. Okay. But again, before we go anywhere else, we'll pause, ask, what questions do you have for me on that basic grammar? We feeling all right about it? Again, it's the sort of thing that, just like we said before, the best way to understand this stuff is to practice. So we'll do a bunch of the symbolization stuff in the upcoming tutorials, and we'll talk more about the fundamental units, but it's just important that we get that foundation right. So let's talk about some sentences with one quantifier. Remember, the whole of FOL, first order logic, is going to be names, predicates, quantifiers, connectives. Really, that should say terms there. And what this means is that we're simply going to be able to combine these elements in various ways and recapture the structure of natural language, sentences, arguments, collections of sentences, etc. Now, when we're trying to do that symbolization, it's really important to understand the structure of the underlying natural language sentences. Sometimes we'll be able to see the relevant FOL structure. Other times it'll be useful to paraphrase the English. Paraphrase here meaning changing the grammar without changing the meaning. So I can give you an example of this. And this will be syncatagrammatic adjectives. So here's a jokey example, but a good one. Right? This should be Dale. But here's Dale. Dale's a fat American. How do we symbolize Dale as a fat American? Using our key here. Yeah. FD conjunction AD. Right? Because what this sentence is really saying is that Dale is fat and Dale is American. Right? No problem. Here's Zlatan. Zlatan is decidedly not fat nor American, but Zlatan is an asshole, right? I love him very much, but he is an absolute shithead. If you know, you know. Now, if we think about how we would symbolize these sentences about Zlatan, using the stuff we just learned, we run into a funny issue. So take Zlatan's a good footballer, Zlatan's a person, and Zlatan's a good person. If we treat these the same way we did with Dale being a fat American, we get something like this. Here's the problem. This doesn't capture what the English is actually saying. Right? Because the English, especially with sentences 1 and 3, aren't saying that Zlatan is good and blah, blah, blah. Right? Sentence 1 is telling us that he is a skillful football player. Right? The good is modifying footballer. It's not modifying Zlatan directly. So this symbolization, this key, is incorrect. This is not tracking the structure of the English. These ain't right. So what we got to do is instead use a slightly different structure. What we really have is something like Zlatan is a person, check. Zlatan is a good footballer, right? One single predicate, and Zlatan is a good person, one single predicate. It isn't like being fat and American, where we could pull them apart. It is that these are unified into a single complex predicate. So if we symbolize it properly, if we track the actual structure, we get something like that. So why do I mention this? Well, it's important. First little trick is that when you see two adjectives in a row, the sort of apparently syncadagrammatic adjectives, we need to be careful whether they are in fact two different predicates or it's just one complex predicate. Is it more like good footballer or fat American? Because those two could never be the same. So that's already just something here, right? When we're thinking about this going from natural language into FOL, we've got to be very careful about the structure of the natural language. So what I want to do next, and we'll take a break now before we jump into this, but what I want to do when we come back is I want to go through 4 basic structures that we're going to come up a lot. And the 4 basic structures I'm going to characterize using this symbolization, so being in the house or being a terrier, so a type of dog. But really we can think about this just with F's and G's. And we'll come back to that afterwards. But these 4 structures, if we know how to do them, you're going to be able to do about 75% of the stuff we're really interested in. So let's take a break. It's 27, so let's come back at, let's say 40, so 13 minutes from now. Take a break, and we'll come back.